The BARC Speeder is one of the most recognizable Republic vehicles, acting as the main speeder bike of the Grand Army of the Republic for much of the Clone Wars. These versatile war machines appear in numerous configurations over the course of Star Wars: The Clone Wars and other stories from the era, each of them effective in their own way. In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at the BARC Speeder and its many variants, analyzing what made them so much better than the other speeder models of the time.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The BARC Speeder was a product of Aratech Repulsor Company, which also manufactured another model of military speeder bike that was wildly popular in the era, the 74Z, which you probably remember as the speeder bike model seen in Return of the Jedi. Aratech pledged its loyalty to the Republic during the Clone Wars, and during the early months of the war, its 74Zs were the primary speeder bike used by the Grand Army of the Republic. But as the Clone Wars went on, Aratech began experimenting with other speeder bike designs, ultimately resulting in the BARC Speeder. BARC stands for Biker Advanced Recon Commando, and as the name might suggest, the BARC Speeder was originally designed for the exclusive use of the Republic's Advanced Recon Commandos. After their initial deployment in the First Battle of Commando, the first 100 of these ARC troopers requisitioned all sorts of special gear from the Republic suppliers for use on the front lines. And the BARC Speeder was only one of many pieces of equipment that were initially reserved for their use. But like many other pieces of ARC trooper gear, the BARC Speeder didn't stay exclusive. The Speeder performed so well in battle that the Republic ended up making it available to the whole Grand Army. By the end of 22 BBY, it had completely replaced the 74Z as the primary speeder bike of the Clone Army, though the 74Z did continue to see some limited use. Since the control setup for the BARC Speeder was pretty similar to that of the 74Z, it was an easy switch for the Army to make. Over the course of the Clone Wars, clones and Jedi of all classes made use of these versatile war machines. Like with the AT-RT, there were clones who were specifically trained to pilot these speeders, the appropriately named BARC troopers, but most of the time, BARC speeders were just flown by ordinary clones. At roughly 4.5 meters long, the BARC Speeder was only slightly larger than the 74Z, but it nonetheless featured a dramatic increase in firepower, armoring, and speed. As with most speeder bikes, the BARC Speeder was a repulsor lift craft, and it was propelled forward by a set of powerful turbine engines, one mounted on the front of the bike, and two more, meant for steering, mounted to either side of the driver. They propelled the speeder forward at up to 520 km per hour, while the repulsor lifts allowed them to fly pretty high above a planet's surface, to the point where BARC speeders were sometimes used to escort LAAT gunships. The BARC Speeder's driver sat just in front of the main reactor, operating the bike via a pair of pedals and a set of control handlebars. The number of handlebars differed based on the model. Most of those seen only have 2, like the 74Z, while some BARC variants had 4 handlebars for reasons unknown. There was a small computer display at the base of the handlebars, which likely displayed diagnostic data, and somewhere on the bike was a compartment with 5 kilograms of storage space. The BARC Speeder was well armored, much more so than the comparatively skeletal 74Z. The turbine engines each featured adjustable armored flaps to further shield them from enemy fire, which could be adjusted to provide more protection to the driver. But what most dramatically differentiated the BARC Speeder from the 74Z was its armament. While its older cousin only featured a single blaster cannon, the BARC Speeder featured 4, and on top of that, they all appeared to be more powerful than the 74Zs. 2 of these blaster cannons were mounted at the front of the bike on either side of the main turbine engine, somewhat hidden by the forward armor flaps, while 2 others were mounted atop each of the rear maneuvering engines. These guns were primarily intended for anti-personnel use, but they were also effective against other speeder bikes and light vehicles. On top of that, the BARC speeder had hardpoints on its right side that could be used to add attachments to the bike. One such attachment was a portable stretcher, which could be used to rapidly carry a wounded trooper out of the fray. In this configuration, the forward flaps of the BARC speeder were angled outward to shield the passenger's head from the wind. Alternatively, BARC speeders could mount an armed sidecar using these hardpoints. This sidecar could seat a single passenger, and it probably had its own built-in repulsor lifts to support the added weight, as was attached to the main bike only by a pair of thin, adjustable arms. These sidecars featured small repeating blaster turrets for the passenger to man, thus making them worthwhile additions for BARC speeders destined for the front lines. All of these BARC speeder variants were intended strictly for military use, though BARC speeders could be bought on the open market for just over 8,000 credits by those who had the connections. But there was one civilian variant that also saw extensive use, the Rapid Response Police Speeder. This was basically just a BARC speeder with police lights and a different coat of paint, which is interesting because we have our doubts that a police vehicle really needs military-grade blaster cannons on it, never mind 4 of them. These police BARCs were most prominently seen on Coruscant, but presumably they saw use on other Republic worlds as well. Starting toward the end of 22 BBY, BARC speeders were a common sight on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, as well as on Coruscant and other Loyalist worlds. They saw extensive use behind friendly lines, acting as escorts for in-atmosphere gunships serving Republic military bases, and as police vehicles on certain Republic member worlds. On the battlefield, they were frequently used for recon and patrol duties, though they also acted as cavalry on the front lines. Many Jedi seemed particularly fond of BARC speeders, but more often than not, these craft were flown into battle by clone troopers. BARC speeders saw action in battles on Coruscant, Seleucami, Kashyyyk, Christosis, Auto Plutonia, Geonosis, and Kadavo, to name just a few. They proved their combat effectiveness in many of these battles. Notably, in the Siege of Felucia, BARC speeders actually went up against Vulture droids in low atmosphere and came out on top, managing to best the starfighters with their blaster cannons. On Coruscant and Kashyyyk, they played essential roles in driving back droid army forces, showing particular usefulness against droid infantry. And on Seleucami, in the last days of the war, 2 BARC speeders proved effective against a different sort of target, Stas Ali, who was shot down by Commander Neo and a fellow BARC trooper after the issuance of Order 66. For all their effectiveness though, BARC speeders didn't have all that long of an operational history. After the end of the Clone Wars, the Republic became the Empire, and at first, the BARC speeder continued to see use in the hands of Imperial scouts. But just a few years after the end of the war, the BARC speeder was phased out of active duty, replaced by the older 74Z, which would become the Empire's standard issue speeder bike. It's not clear why this switch was made. The BARC speeder was better across the board. It was only a few hundred credits more expensive per unit than the 74Z, and the 2 bikes were made by the same company. Whatever the reason though, the BARC speeder was retired before its time, and by the time of the Galactic Civil War, they were mostly used by spacers and rebels who had acquired them secondhand. So that's the story of the iconic BARC speeder, one of the most recognizable vehicles of the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Do you have any theories as to why the Empire phased these speeders out? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.